In the mid-1880s, the Belgian artist Théo van Rysselberghe, in his 20s and already an established figure in the Brussels avant-garde, was experimenting with new artistic approaches: pointillism, symbolism, neo-impressionism. He painted this portrait of 10-year-old Marguerite van Mons during this transitional period in 1886. Marguerite was the daughter of the artist's friend Emile van Mons, art patron and collector. He painted her and her older sister Camille in the elegant music room of their family home. The girl's body, angular, long-limbed, clad in black, is closely framed, but her fragility and smallness is emphasized by the space above her head and the awkward angle of her arm, reaching up to grasp the door handle. A shining silver bracelet draws attention to her small, pale hand. The form of her dress is conveyed in quick brushstrokes, in tones from silvery grey to black, but her figure gives an impression of flatness, as if she is made from black paper, cut and folded. Marguerite's hair is untidily tucked behind her ears, its reddish-brown tints emphasizing the paleness of her face and the darkness of her large, abstracted eyes. Her lips are slightly open, as if she is about to ask a question. She is an interrogative, tentative presence, an embodied question mark. A child, on the verge of the changes that will bring her to adulthood, she seems to be asking, "When I open the door, what will I find? What will I step into? What kind of world have you made for me?" The artist Henri Lehmann painted this portrait of his cousin, Faustine Leo, in 1842. Faustine was born in 1832, so she would have been about 10 years old when Lehmann painted this portrait. He painted and drew Faustine several times, along with other members of her family. He signed this picture, recorded where it was painted, Saint-Cloud, just west of Paris, and dated it very precisely, 20th September to 10th October, 1842. Henri Lehmann was of German origin. He was born in Kiel, in the Duchy of Holstein, in 1814, and studied first under his father, Leo Lehmann, who was a portrait painter, before moving to Paris in 1831. There he became a pupil of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who had recently returned from a period of self-imposed exile in Italy and had set up an atelier. Lehmann was perhaps the most successful of Ingres' pupils, attracting notice and patronage, if not always critical acclaim, for his large-scale figure compositions on classical, religious, and historical subjects, and, above all, for his portraits. From the 1830s, his whole career was spent in France, and he became a naturalized French citizen in 1846. He exhibited regularly at the Salon, and also taught at the École des Beaux-Arts. He died in Paris in 1882. Henri Lehmann's portrait of Faustine Leo is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and today it is probably the artist's best-known work. Faustine herself died in 1865, when she was only in her early 30s, but the portrait remained in her family until 1988, when it was bought by a private collector. It remained in private hands until the Met bought it in 2003. The portrait is of reasonably large size, 1 meter tall, and on a rectangular canvas, but the image itself is oval in form, to fit in a frame with an oval opening. The picture still retains its original neoclassical frame of gilded wood. Lehmann would favor the oval form for portraits throughout his career. In important ways, this portrait conforms to the pattern followed by Lehmann's mentor Ingres, a 3/4-length portrait of a female sitter, immaculately presented in fine clothing. However, Lehmann departs from Ingres in his substitution of simplicity for sumptuousness in colors and finishes, and by favoring a stylized, mannered treatment rather than Ingres' characteristic polished naturalism. A similar approach can be seen in this painting by another pupil of Ingres, Eugène Emmanuel Amaury Duval, which is a portrait of Isaure Chassereau, painted in 1838. Here the archaic hieratic style and the simplification of forms, with the sitter seemingly reduced to a rigidly symmetrical system of cones and cylinders, produce an effect of refined artificiality that is more mannerist than romantic. Lehmann also pursued an idealization of forms and a mannered style, consciously avoiding the naturalism that was rising to favour in both Germany and France in the 1830s and 40s. He found his inspiration in the works of his mentor Ingres, whom he always revered, but also in the revivalist, archaicizing tradition associated with the Nazarene painters of early 19th century Germany, who evoked the aesthetic and spiritual heritage of the High Middle Ages and Renaissance in their works. This influence can be seen in Lehmann's clear, saturated colours and smooth finish, and the crisply linear clarity with which his forms are modelled. One painting that is sometimes cited as an inspiration for Lehmann's portrait of Faustine, or at least as a work to which Lehmann may have been responding, is this portrait of the Comtesse de la Tour Maubourg, wife of the French ambassador to the Holy See, which was painted by Théodore Chasserio in 1841. Chasserio was another pupil of Ingres. Ingres' students were a tight-knit group. We have just seen the portrait of Chasserio's niece Isaure, painted by his fellow student Henri Duval, and among them close friendships coexisted with sometimes intense rivalries. Lehmann and Chasserio were rivals, and Lehmann, at a time when the two painters were in Rome, had hoped to win the commission for this portrait, but was rejected. This happened just after another important commission, a portrait of the Dominican priest Dominique Lacordaire, had been won by Chasserio at Lehmann's expense, and in fact it was Chasserio's portrait of Lacordaire that led to him being commissioned as her portraitist by the Countess. Lehmann, bitter and disappointed, was very critical of this portrait when it was completed. As it happened, so was almost everyone else, and the negative response so infuriated the Countess that it led to a complete breakdown of relations between sitter and painter. For all Lehmann's hostility to Chasserio's portrait of the Countess, he may nonetheless have been influenced by the pale oval face with its large eyes and dreamy gaze, the position of the hands, and the general atmosphere of stylization and remoteness. Another potential source of inspiration for Lehmann's painting of Faustine is a much earlier work, Ingres' portrait of 13-year-old Mademoiselle Caroline Rivière. This painting, exhibited at the Salon of 1806, is more strongly in the romantic tradition than Lehmann's, and embodies the romantic discovery of childhood as a period of authenticity, freedom, and connection with nature. This can be seen in the painting's emphasis on the rural landscape setting behind Caroline, through which runs, in a play on her family name, a river. Lehmann's portrait, distanced from that romanticism, is less passionate than Ingres', just as his bright Italian Renaissance landscape is more idealized and artificial than Ingres' softly verdant and naturalistic French river valley. But the parallels between the two pictures are clear. The motif of a gracefully posed and elegantly clad young female figure depicted against a background of river and hills, the relationship between figure and setting, the concern to convey not only the youth and beauty, but the character of the sitter. Lehmann's viewpoint in his portrait of Faustine is slightly lower than Ingres' in his depiction of Caroline, which gives Faustine's small figure additional stature, reinforced by her relative height against the landscape behind her. Although Faustine is a child, Lehmann gives her the presence of an adult. She stands amid a foreground of twisting vines, while the background landscape, representing the Roman Campagna in high summer, stretches away behind her, richly verdant and scattered with white buildings, with a wide river traversed by bridges leading the eye towards green hills and the arches of an aqueduct in the distance. This setting evokes the medieval or Renaissance past, and this historicizing aspect of the painting is strengthened by Faustine's clothing and her garlanded hair. The girl is wearing a pink dress of simple form, embellished with white lace, and wears a sash of red and white around her waist. The surfaces are smooth, and there is a strong clarity and linearity in the forms and the composition, exemplified by the sculpture-like folds of Faustine's dress. The saturated colours bring a jewel-like richness to the painting and evoke warmth and emotional feeling. Faustine's hairstyle is classically inspired, fashionable for a period when neoclassicism remained very influential, and she is wearing flowers in her hair. They are fuchsias, Fuchsia magellanica, in two different forms, one with elongated buds and one with round buds. Fuchsias were, at just this time, very fashionable, and were attracting a great deal of interest. They had been brought to Europe from South America in the late 18th century, but it was only around the period of this painting that they were successfully hybridized, with new cultivars increasing the plant's popularity. Faustine's Fuchsia magellanica is not a hybrid, but one of the original species brought to Europe from Chile in the 1780s, from which the new varieties were developed. Faustine's large eyes hold the viewer with a gaze that is almost mesmerizing, creating an air of intimacy, of connection between sitter and painter, and, by extension, sitter and viewer. Lehmann was criticized by Charles Baudelaire for making the eyes of his female sitters too large and unnatural. Monsieur Lehmann, he wrote in 1846, makes nothing but eyes too large, where the pupil swims like an oyster in a soup tureen. But in this case, Faustine's large eyes seem to encompass the world and reflect it back with appropriately childlike wonder, wonder which she invites the onlooker to share. Another criticism directed at Lehmann was his manner of representing flesh in his paintings, which, to some observers, seemed hard and artificial. The critic Charles Blanc wrote of him that he makes women's flesh as polished and hard as ivory. Faustine does, in places, for example her shoulders, resemble a cold, pale, and rather heavily modelled ivory sculpture, but the soft pink and golden tints Lehmann has used in the face, arms, and hands counteract that impression, and convey the qualities of softness and warmth that characterize the painting as a whole. Faustine's stance, slightly turned towards the viewer with her hands clasped in front of her, as if pausing for a moment while taking a walk, emphasizes her slenderness and fragility, while her slightly parted lips animate her otherwise rather idealized face, and suggest that she is about to speak, or simply to smile, again reinforcing that sense of engaging intimacy between subject and observer. For all the mannered formality of this portrait, it possesses warmth and humanity, and a touch of spontaneity, and presents Faustine as a personality with an individual character and an inner life, not remote, but approachable and knowable. This portrait was painted in 1850 by Constantin Hansen, a leading artist of Danish painting's golden age. The sitter is Hansen's 11-year-old sister-in-law, Elise Købke. With quick, lively brushstrokes he captures his young relative in a moment of everyday domestic activity. This simple portrait has something of the character of a religious image, the clear light falling on the child's face, her solemn expression and rather distant, abstracted gaze, the visual emphasis on the cup as if it is a ritual vessel, all create a quasi-religious atmosphere. The simple composition and colours reinforce the contemplative mood. Elise's position at the table creates recession in the shallow picture space. Her brownish-red dress and cap with ribbons, reminiscent of the Renaissance, glow against the dark green background. Her white collar stands out, reflecting the shining white of the cup and saucer, and giving extra definition to her head and face. The warm flesh tones of her face and arms bring her forwards, encroaching upon the foreground, as if we are sitting opposite her at table. Perhaps she was in a dream world of her own, and some word from us has caused her to look up, although her eyes suggest her thoughts are still elsewhere. In a letter Hansen wrote while painting this portrait, he described Elise as lovable. Sadly, she died in 1857, aged just 17. The artist Thomas Gainsborough married Margaret Burr in London on 15th July 1746. Thomas was 19 years old, and Margaret was perhaps 18. She was the illegitimate daughter of the 3rd Duke of Beaufort, and was almost certainly already pregnant. Perhaps because of this, or Margaret's illegitimacy, or both, the marriage took place at the private chapel in Mayfair of the Reverend Alexander Keith, who was notorious for performing clandestine, but perfectly legal, marriages. Margaret's father, who had died the year before, had settled £200 a year upon her through the Beaufort estate, which was a useful sum of money for a young and still struggling artist. But whatever the circumstances of the marriage, Thomas and Margaret loved each other, and their family circle was a close and affectionate one. The Gainsboroughs' first child, the child Margaret was pregnant with when she married Thomas, was born in late 1746 and christened Mary, but she died before she was 18 months old. Her father showed her nestled between himself and his wife in a family group that must have been painted in early 1748, shortly before Mary died. The painting was left unfinished. The Gainsboroughs went on to have 2 more children, Mary, born in early 1750, and Margaret, born in the summer of 1751. Thomas and Margaret were loving and protective parents, and Thomas painted many portraits of his daughters as they grew up. They are filled with a father's feelings for his children, affection, pride, and anxiety. In 1756, the Gainsboroughs were living in Ipswich, having returned to Thomas's hometown of Sudbury in 1748, before moving to Ipswich in 1751, in the hope that the larger size of the town and its more developed cultural life would produce a better market for his work. 3 years later, and for the same reason, he would move on to Bath. But in about 1756, while still living in Ipswich with his family, Gainsborough painted this double portrait of Mary and Margaret, the painter's daughters chasing a butterfly. This was not a commission, but was a private work, painted for the artist and his family. In these personal works, Gainsborough was able to experiment and paint with freedom, following his natural talent for exploring light, colour, and movement to produce an image filled with spontaneity and sincerity of feeling. The painting shows Margaret on the left, who would have been about 5 years old at the time the picture was painted, and her older sister Mary on the right, between 6 and 7 years old. The two are in a landscape setting, with rough ground and foliage around them, under a rather turbulent sky. On the left edge of the picture, a butterfly has alighted on the top of a thistle. The eyes of both girls are on the butterfly, and Margaret reaches forward to try and catch it in her right hand, while Mary, whose own right hand is holding firmly onto her sister's left hand, seems to be pulling away or trying to hold Margaret back, as if, while the younger sister symbolizes eagerness, she, the elder sister, represents caution. The landscape background and the sky are both dark, and the ground on which the girls stand is also dark in tone. The only light areas of the canvas, standing out brightly against the darkness, are the faces and figures of the two girls, and the butterfly, which draws their eyes and ours like a point of light in a dark space. The girls' figures in their light clothing glow against the sombre and shadowed background, seeming to flicker above the ground in an echo of the butterfly's light staccato movements. The shapes of the girls' dresses resemble the shape of a butterfly with outspread wings, with their linked hands at the center of the butterfly's body, and in their colors, too, they resemble the wings of the butterfly. The horizontal centerline of the painting passes through the two girls' waists. Even though Margaret is smaller than Mary, her figure is raised slightly compared to that of her sister, so that their waists are at the same level, suggesting emotional closeness and an equality of partnership in their activities, despite the difference in their ages. The vertical centerline of the canvas passes along the left side of Margaret's body. The angle at which she is moving as she reaches for the butterfly makes her lean forwards and outwards, while her sister's body is tilted backwards and in the opposite direction. This pulling in different directions creates a sense of tension and movement. The figures are placed asymmetrically on the canvas. With the exception of Margaret's outstretched right arm and her lower leg and foot, the girls' figures are confined to the right 2/3 of the canvas, while the focus of the picture is with Margaret's hand and the butterfly, itself 1/3 of the canvas height from the top of the picture, on the extreme left. It is here that the viewer's gaze, in turn, is drawn. A zigzag line can be traced across the canvas, from the butterfly through Margaret's outstretched arm, the two girls' arms and linked hands, and Mary's raised hand and flung-back apron, creating an additional sense of movement, with energy unfolding from right to left to find a focus in Margaret's outreaching hand and spread fingers. Much of the feeling of freedom and spontaneity in the painting comes from Gainsborough's brushwork. The paint is applied with rapidity and a lack of constraint, and parts of the picture are little more than sketched in, or seem to have been left deliberately unfinished. The girls' faces are carefully modelled, strongly lit from the front, with a smooth finish to the skin and finely brushed highlights bringing out the play of light on their hair and the glints in their expressive, shining eyes. The butterfly, too, is depicted in precise and fine detail, and its species and sex can be identified. A female large white or cabbage white. The plant it has alighted on is also identifiable. It is a marsh thistle, an important source of nectar for pollinators from the early summer. Outside these areas of smooth finish and high definition, the handling of paint is quick and gestural, with loose and expressive brush strokes. Some forms are defined with a very few basic strokes of the brush, while others appear as if left unfinished. Passages of the girls' dresses and shoes and of the landscape background are blocked in with robust strokes or deftly defined with a few calligraphic brush strokes. This enhances the sense of movement and gives the two figures the impression of being in motion against their background, moving from right to left in front of, or even coming towards, a viewer standing in front of the painting. This picture is defined by movement, movement through space and movement through time. It captures a moment of youth, a moment as beautiful and as fugitive as the butterfly. So what meanings does the picture convey? It is a sensitive and loving portrait by a father of his children, an affectionate celebration by a parent who has already lost one child, of his two surviving children, healthy, happy, and full of life. More generally, it can be seen as a representation of the carefree joys of childhood and the loving closeness of two sisters who are making their way through the first years of their lives, hand in hand. During the 18th century, childhood was increasingly seen as a state of life in its own right, rather than just a preparatory stage for adulthood. The two girls are represented here not as miniature or incomplete adults, but as autonomous, individual, and fully rounded beings. They are shown experiencing, observing, and interacting with the natural world, without adult mediation, or the intervention of society's rules and expectations. Their individuality in appearance, behavior, and character is captured, and their distinct impressions are sensitively conveyed. Margaret, wide-eyed and with her mouth slightly open, expresses eagerness and excitement, the unreflective and unmediated enthusiasms of youth, while her sister, whose mouth is closed and whose eyes are wary, conveys caution, stopping to think before acting. In a way, this is the contrast between sense in the person of the older Mary and sensibility in the younger Margaret. Ideas of education and development thus underlie the image embodied in the distinct responses and attitudes of the two sisters. Margaret, entranced by the beauty of the butterfly, reaches out unthinkingly to seize it, as we might try to seize any beautiful thing, but her older sister sees the dangers and holds her back. If she does take hold of the butterfly, she will almost certainly crush it, ruining the very beauty she is trying to take hold of, while if the butterfly flutters out of reach, her hand will close around the plant it was resting on, the spiky thistle, and she will be hurt. The butterfly itself is a complex symbol. It represents the beauty of the natural world, and the benefits of allowing children to explore that world and be educated about its wonders. It suggests the human desire to seek out beauty, to take hold of it before it fades and is lost, while also reminding us that beauty cannot be seized and kept safe from the ravages of time. It represents the transience of childhood, the impossibility of holding on to youth, and the pitfalls and dangers that await children as they progress towards adulthood. The image of the child chasing a butterfly was often used in 18th century sermons, educational literature, and even poems and ballads to teach moral lessons about the dangers of wasting time in idle pursuits, about the fleeting nature of life, the impermanence of pleasure and beauty, the dangers of distraction by the gaudy temptations of the world, about flirtation and inconstancy, about vanity, a vice to which girls and young women were believed to be particularly prone. More positively, it is also a symbol of transformation. Just as the caterpillar transforms itself into a butterfly, so these young girls will transform themselves into women. And in another transformative sense, the butterfly was the symbol of the human soul and of resurrection. Perhaps the butterfly whose fluttering flight accompanies Mary and Margaret through the dark landscape represents the first Mary, the sister they never knew, who died before they were born. Perhaps for Gainsborough, this was a painting not of two children, but of three. John Russell, born in 1745, was the leading British artist in pastel from the 1770s to his death in 1806. Pastel flourished during the 18th century. Artists such as Rosalba Carriera, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, Maurice Quentin de la Tour, and Francis Coates, who was Russell's teacher, made the medium fashionable and popular. There was a particularly strong demand for pastel portraits, an art form in which Russell excelled. This vibrant double portrait in pastel and chalk displays to the full his artistry and technical ability. It shows two of his daughters, Maria, born 1781, and Anne, born 1782, both of whom were artists in their own right. Anne is showing her sister a landscape she has drawn in chalk on a slate. She has her porte-crayon holding the chalk in her right hand. Their two heads are poised to accentuate their family resemblance, while the differences in their dress and hairstyles signal their individuality. The physical closeness of the two, their encircling arms, convey the family affection that binds them together. The landscape drawing, the sky and foliage to the right, the informality of the poses and free style of hair and dress, all represent the closeness to nature and desire for personal liberty that was central to the sensibilities of the Romantic age. If you have a child who is artistic and creative and loves painting, drawing, or some other art form, then of course the right thing to do is to support that child in developing his or her artistic talents and skills. That is what the parents of this girl did. She grew up in late 17th century Switzerland and showed marked artistic talent while still very young. Her father, an important and influential figure in her home city of Zurich, was ambitious for his daughter. He ensured she had a good education and supported her in receiving artistic training and developing her career. But, motivated by the money she brought in, he drove her too hard. She died young, and her story has a sad end. That talented, dedicated, and well-educated Swiss girl painted this self-portrait in 1691, when she was 12 years old. Her name was Anna Vasa. She signed and dated the work in an inscription in which she also gives her age, painted by Anna Vasa of Zurich at the age of 12 in the year 1691. Above the inscription she has painted the Vasa family coat of arms, an assertion of her identity and social status. Within this self-portrait is another portrait. Anna Vasa is painting a portrait of a man in hat, coat, and furs on a small canvas or board supported on an easel. He is Johannes Sulzer, a painter and engraver born in 1652, who lived in Winterthur, and who was Anna's tutor when she painted this picture. The Swiss artist, collector, and writer Johann Caspar Fuseli, who owned this portrait and who wrote a biography of Anna Vasa, notes that Sulzer was judged insufficiently skilled to be the teacher of such an artistic prodigy, and, with her father's support, she became a student of the more notable Swiss painter Joseph Werner in Bern, after impressing him by painting a perfect copy of one of his own works. She poses with a brush in her right hand, as if adding detail to the painting. Her left hand holds her oval wooden palette and her brushes and marl stick. Her gaze is clear and confident. Her slight smile suggests her pride in her work. Anna is well dressed, as befits a girl from a prosperous and high-status family. She wears a cap, probably of black velvet, and a decorative collar in traditional Swiss style. Over her linen shift she has on an elaborately decorated bodice with silver chains and pendants, and also wears a finely pleated skirt of red-dyed wool, fronted with an apron of waxed linen. All the details of the clothing are very carefully delineated with delicate touches of the brush. Anna Vasa, as with many other women artists who painted themselves in fine clothing, was not trying to show what she would actually have worn when painting, but depicted herself in clothing that expressed her respectability and social status. The portrait was intended to impress, and it did so, and continues to do so today. In due course, after an apprenticeship with Joseph Werner that Fuseli describes as highly successful, with teacher and student united in mutual esteem and perfect agreement, Anna Vasa set up in Zurich as a painter specializing in portrait miniatures. she achieved considerable success, with clients for her works in England, Germany, and Holland, as well as Switzerland, although her health and her skills suffered from her father's constant pressure upon her to produce more work and bring more income to the family. In 1699 she was appointed court painter to the Count of Solms-Braunfels in Hesse, Germany, where she was happy and productive, but her father continued to put pressure on her, and in 1702 she had to return to the family home in Zurich. There, amid the demands of her parents and her domestic labours, her ability to paint and her health declined. She fell seriously ill, to the extent that she was no longer able to look after herself, being cared for in her final years by her sisters. In the words of Fuseli, she lost her physical and her emotional strength, and died of a fall in 1713, at the age of 34.